They thought she was just a poor old woman, someone unworthy of their attention. But when she revealed her wedding gift, the entire room fell silent. What was inside that made the wealthy aristocrats forget their superiority? Watch until the end to find out. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. What would you have done in her place? The Vander Holts had always been a family of prestige, wealth, and unshakable tradition. Their name carried weight in high society, a legacy built over generations of power and influence. Their grand estate stood as a testament to their status. A mansion with towering marble columns, a polished mahogany staircase, and chandeliers that cast golden reflections across the hand-woven carpets. To outsiders, the Vanderholts were the epitome of refinement, a family whose name was synonymous with class, power, and legacy. And at the head of this family stood Richard and Eleanor Vanderholt, a couple who had spent their lives ensuring that their name remained untarnished. Richard, a man of precision and control, had built upon the family's wealth, expanding their reach into finance and real estate. Eleanor, poised and elegant, had navigated high society with the same level of calculation, ensuring that their family remained at the top of the social hierarchy. Their son, William, had been groomed from birth to continue the dynasty. Educated in the finest schools, introduced to the right circles, and surrounded by the elite, William had always known what was expected of him. His marriage was no exception. It was understood that he would one day marry a woman of equal standing, someone with the right name, the right lineage, and the right refinement. Someone who would uphold the Vanderholt name with dignity and class. That evening, when William invited his parents to a private dinner, Eleanor and Richard assumed the purpose of the gathering without question. Their son had been discreet about his romantic endeavors, but they were certain that his announcement would be about his engagement. They had speculated among themselves, narrowing down the possibilities. Perhaps Charlotte Fairmont, the daughter of a banking magnate, or Isabel Harrington, whose family had deep European aristocratic ties. Whoever it was, they were confident that she would be someone of significance. Eleanor had ensured that the evening was perfect. The dining table was adorned with fine china, crystal glasses sparkling under the glow of the chandelier. A team of servers moved with precision, presenting each dish flawlessly. Richard, ever the man of business, wasted no time in getting to the point. "So, son," he said, taking a measured sip of his wine, "you've called us here for a reason. Shall we hear it?" William hesitated for a brief moment, his expression composed but carrying an edge of tension. His gaze flickered toward his mother before returning to his father. "I wanted to tell you both personally," he said, his voice steady. "I'm engaged." Eleanor exhaled a quiet breath of satisfaction, exchanging a knowing look with Richard. "Wonderful news," she said smoothly, her smile poised. "And who is the lucky young lady?" William set down his glass with deliberate care before answering. "Her name is Naomi." The name did not carry the familiarity they had expected. No Fairmont, no Harrington, no recognizable ties to their social circles. Eleanor's smile barely faltered, but Richard leaned slightly forward, his interest shifting from enthusiasm to scrutiny. "And her family?" Richard asked. "Which of our acquaintances might we know them from?" William had anticipated this moment. He knew his parents well enough to predict their reaction, but he remained firm. "Naomi comes from a different background," he admitted. "She wasn't raised in our social circles." There was a pause. Eleanor, ever the master of grace, was the first to respond. "That's not necessarily a concern," she said with measured politeness. as long as she understands the responsibilities that come with being a part of this family. Richard, however, was not so easily pacified. His gaze remained fixed on his son, calculating. "What exactly do you mean by a different background?" he pressed. William met his father's gaze without hesitation. "She was raised by her mother, a woman named Josephine." Richard's fingers tapped lightly against the table, his expression unreadable. "And what does her mother do?" "She's a craftswoman," William said, his voice unwavering. "A woodcarver." Silence fell over the table. The air seemed heavier, weighted with unspoken judgments. Eleanor's fingers rested delicately on the stem of her glass, though she made no move to take a sip. Richard studied his son as though deciphering a foreign language. "A woodcarver," he repeated, the word carrying a distinct weight of implication, though his tone remained neutral. "Yes," William confirmed. "She has been a craftswoman her entire life." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. "And where does she live?" "In a small town outside the city," William replied. "A quiet place, nothing extravagant." Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "William, you must understand our concern. Marriage is not just about love, it's about compatibility, about shared values and expectations. The woman you marry will represent this family." William's jaw tightened slightly. "Naomi is intelligent, kind, and deeply principled. She shares our values in the ways that matter." Richard's expression remained impassive, though his fingers tapped thoughtfully against the table. "She may share certain values," he said, "but her upbringing is vastly different. Her mother," he hesitated for a fraction of a second, "would be your children's grandmother. What do you know about her?" William's response came without hesitation. "She is a good woman, hard-working. She raised Naomi with love and integrity." The room remained silent for a long moment before Richard finally spoke again. "I see," he said at last, his voice even. "Well, we will of course have to meet them." It was not an invitation. It was an obligation, a necessary assessment. Eleanor nodded in agreement, her smile still practiced but not entirely genuine. "Yes," she agreed, "we should meet them. After all, family is the most important thing." But beneath those words lay an unspoken understanding. The Vander Holts would decide for themselves whether Naomi, and by extension her mother, were truly fit to join their ranks. Josephine had lived in the same small house for over 40 years. It was not grand, nor was it adorned with extravagant decor, but it was a home in every sense of the word. The wooden floors creaked underfoot. The walls were decorated not with expensive paintings but with hand-carved pieces, each telling a story. The scent of fresh bread and aged wood lingered in the air, a comforting mixture of warmth and craftsmanship. Josephine had built much of this house with her own hands, just as her father had before her. Every chair, every shelf, every intricate carving bore the mark of her skill and patience. She had never desired riches or social standing. Her wealth was in her work, in the tangible beauty of the things she created, in the love she poured into each piece. Now, as she sat at her modest wooden table, sipping tea from an old ceramic cup, she watched her daughter, Naomi, who sat across from her, shifting uncomfortably. Josephine could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she pressed her lips together as if debating how to say what was on her mind. She did not rush her daughter, merely waited with the same quiet patience that had served her well all her life. Finally, Naomi exhaled, setting her cup down carefully before speaking. "They want to meet you," she said. "William's parents." Josephine nodded slowly, as if the words were no surprise to her. I expected they would. Naomi hesitated. They come from a different world, Mama. They have certain expectations. Josephine chuckled softly, taking another sip of tea. A certain way of seeing things, she mused. You mean they think I'm beneath them? Naomi winced but did not deny it. I don't know that for sure, she said carefully, but I do know they place a lot of value on status. Josephine set her cup down and folded her hands in her lap. I've met people like that before, she said simply. They see money as a measure of worth. It's nothing new to me. Her daughter looked at her with concern. I just don't want them to look down on you. Josephine smiled gently. Let them look wherever they please. I am who I am. I won't pretend to be anything else. Later that evening, William arrived at their home, standing a little straighter than usual, as if preparing himself for a formal engagement. Josephine greeted him with warmth, offering him a seat at her kitchen table. He accepted with a grateful nod, though she could sense his unease. He had come from a world of polished floors and crystal chandeliers, and now he sat in a home where things were built by hand, where nothing sparkled except the warmth in the air. You treat my daughter well, Josephine said, watching him closely. That's all that matters to me. William met her gaze and nodded. I love her, he said simply, and I respect you, ma'am. Josephine studied him for a moment before nodding. Good, then we'll have no problems. The dinner with the Vander Holts was set for the following week. Naomi was anxious, knowing her mother would be stepping into an environment where she would be judged before she even spoke a word. Josephine, however, remained unbothered. She had nothing to prove to these people. She had built her life with her own hands, raised her daughter with love and integrity, and lived without regret. If the Vander Holts wanted to scrutinize her, let them. On the evening of the dinner, the Vander Holt estate stood tall against the darkening sky, its grand facade illuminated by golden light. The long driveway was lined with neatly trimmed hedges leading to an entrance flanked by towering marble columns. The mansion itself was an architectural masterpiece, its grandeur a declaration of wealth and legacy. Inside, the dining room was prepared with meticulous attention to detail. A polished mahogany table stretched across the room, adorned with fine china, gleaming silverware, and a crystal vase filled with fresh orchids. The air smelled of expensive wine, and delicately seasoned dishes blended seamlessly with the faint scent of wax polish and aged wood. Eleanor Vander Holt, dressed in an emerald gown that draped elegantly over her frame, made final adjustments to the seating arrangement. Her expression was composed, though a trace of unease lingered beneath her practiced elegance. Richard Vander Holt stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the long driveway outside. They're late, he murmured, though the clock showed they were precisely on time. They'll be here soon, William said evenly, though the tension in the room was unmistakable. Then a car pulled up outside. The butler opened the grand front doors, and Naomi stepped out first, dressed in an elegant but simple black dress. Her hair was neatly styled, her posture poised, but there was a tightness in her shoulders. Behind her, Josephine emerged from the car. She wore a well-pressed suit, old but carefully maintained, with a dark brown scarf draped over her shoulders. She walked slowly, deliberately, leaning slightly on her cane, not out of weakness, but out of habit. Her movements carried the weight of years, a quiet dignity that had been earned rather than inherited. As they entered, the contrast between the two worlds was impossible to ignore. Josephine, a woman shaped by time and toil, stepping into a house where wealth had shielded its inhabitants from hardship. The marble floors gleamed beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, the walls lined with artwork worth more than entire neighborhoods. The butler hesitated a fraction of a second before offering to take Josephine's coat, as if uncertain how to address her. Naomi took her mother's arm gently and guided her forward. "Mother, Father." William stepped closer, his voice steady. "This is Josephine, Naomi's mother." For the briefest of moments, silence settled over the room. The Vanderholts had spent decades mastering the art of refined social politeness, but even they could not entirely mask their reaction. Richard's lips pressed together slightly, and Eleanor's perfectly sculpted smile froze just a fraction too long before she extended her hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Josephine," she said, her tone smooth but cool. Josephine smiled politely. "Josephine is fine," she responded, shaking Eleanor's hand firmly without the deference Eleanor was accustomed to. Richard extended his hand next, gripping hers just a bit too firmly, as if testing something unspoken. Josephine met his gaze without flinching. "Shall we move to the dining room?" Eleanor suggested quickly, regaining her composure. The transition to the dining room was seamless, but the unspoken divide remained. Josephine walked with quiet dignity, her gaze absorbing the extravagance around her without awe or intimidation. She had seen wealth before, perhaps not at this level, but she had never measured a person's worth by the weight of their possessions. Dinner began with carefully rehearsed pleasantries. Eleanor led the conversation with the usual topics: art, travel, the changing seasons. Naomi did her best to ease the tension, but William could see the subtle undertones in his parents' demeanor. Every word, every glance, every polite but distant smile was a measured evaluation. Then, as expected, the conversation took the turn everyone had been waiting for. "So, Josephine," Richard said, setting his glass down, his voice light but edged with something more pointed, "William tells us you are a craftswoman." Josephine nodded, taking a sip of water before replying. "That's right. I've been carving wood for most of my life." Richard tilted his head slightly. "Fascinating. And you make furniture?" "Among other things," Josephine answered. "I specialize in intricate carvings, masks, sculptures, pieces with historical significance." Richard exchanged a brief glance with Eleanor before nodding. "A family tradition, then?" Josephine met his gaze, recognizing the attempt to place her within a specific category, one that fit their narrative of a working-class artisan. "Something like that," she replied calmly. The evaluation had begun. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations, none of which felt like they belonged to Naomi. The moment Eleanor and Richard Vanderholt took control of the planning, any notion of an intimate, meaningful ceremony faded into an orchestrated display of wealth and status. What had once been a dream shared between Naomi and William was now a grand affair designed to impress high society rather than celebrate love. The venue had been changed from the quiet garden Naomi had envisioned to the grand ballroom of one of the most prestigious hotels in the city. The guest list had expanded from a small gathering of close friends and family to over 200 of the most influential figures in society. Every detail, from the floral arrangements to the choice of music, was carefully curated to reflect the Vanderholt name rather than the wishes of the bride and groom. Naomi found herself drowning in meetings with wedding planners who treated her as an accessory to the event rather than the bride. Dresses were chosen for their elegance rather than comfort. Speeches were crafted to highlight the importance of family legacy rather than love, and every decision seemed to serve one purpose: ensuring that the wedding upheld the Vanderholt reputation. William, though supportive, was caught between his loyalty to Naomi and the weight of his parents' expectations. Time and again, he reassured her that the wedding was just one day, that their life together was what truly mattered. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one day. This was about control, about dominance, about reminding her and her mother where they stood in the grand hierarchy of the Vanderholts. Through it all, Josephine remained quiet. She watched as her daughter's excitement dimmed under the weight of expectations. She listened as Naomi voiced her frustrations, her exhaustion, her disappointment. And though she said little, Josephine saw everything. There were battles a mother could not fight for her daughter, but there were things she could still do. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it came an air of extravagance that seemed to consume everything in its path. The grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of countless chandeliers, their crystal prisms casting golden light across the polished marble floors. Towering floral arrangements, imported from abroad, lined the room. A live orchestra played a carefully selected repertoire of classical pieces, and waiters in pressed uniforms moved in perfect synchronization, ensuring that every guest's glass remained full and every plate remained untouched until the perfect moment. For the guests, it was the event of the season, an opportunity to witness the union of one of the most distinguished families in high society. The air was thick with admiration, subtle competition, and carefully measured pleasantries exchanged between those whose lives revolved around wealth and influence. Naomi stood before a mirror in the lavish bridal suite, her reflection a stranger to her. The dress she wore was exquisite. Layers of delicate lace, intricate beading, a long, flowing train that shimmered under the soft lighting. It was breathtaking, perfect in every way, except for the one that mattered. It did not feel like hers. She smoothed the fabric, her fingers trailing over the details, but the unease in her chest refused to fade. This was not the intimate wedding she had dreamed of. This was not what she had wanted. But she reminded herself that the most important thing remained unchanged. At the end of the day, she would be married to William. That was what mattered. She took a deep breath, pushing down the doubt, and turned toward her mother. Josephine sat in the corner of the room, dressed in her best suit, a modest yet dignified choice. She had watched the transformation of the wedding unfold with patient eyes, never voicing her thoughts on the excess and vanity displayed around her. But Naomi knew what she must have felt. Naomi knelt slightly so they were at eye level. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Josephine chuckled, shaking her head. "You're the one getting married today, and you're asking if I'm all right?" Naomi smiled, but there was an unspoken weight in her eyes. "I just want to make sure you don't feel out of place." Josephine reached out, taking her daughter's hands in hers, her fingers rough from years of work, but steady, unwavering. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said. "Don't let them make you forget why you're here." Naomi squeezed her mother's hands, drawing strength from the steadiness of her presence. Then, with a final deep breath, she rose to her feet. It was time. The ballroom hushed as Naomi made her entrance. Heads turned, whispers passed between lips, but she barely registered them. Her gaze was fixed on one thing: William, standing at the far end of the aisle, waiting for her. He looked handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, but it was not his appearance that made her heart steady itself. It was the warmth in his eyes, the silent promise that despite everything, this moment was theirs. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause filled the room, blending with the swelling music of the orchestra. As the evening progressed and the reception began, Naomi noticed something, a quiet tension that had begun to surface beneath the polished veneer of the event. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance from a guest, a hushed whisper exchanged between two well-dressed figures, a quick look of curiosity or disbelief directed toward Josephine, who sat among the crowd with quiet dignity, unaffected by the scrutiny. Then, as dinner was served and the wine flowed, the tension became more pronounced. The Vander Holts, particularly Richard and Eleanor, had carefully avoided drawing attention to Josephine throughout the evening. They had introduced her politely, made the necessary formalities, but beyond that, they had subtly ensured that she remained an afterthought in the grand scheme of the event. Until now. It began with an offhand comment from one of the wealthier guests, a man whose family had long been acquainted with the Vanderholts. He swirled the deep red wine in his glass, his voice carrying the smooth arrogance that was so common in these circles. "So, Mrs. Josephine," he said, "I hear you're a craftswoman." Josephine nodded, unfazed by the implied condescension. "That's right." The guest's lips curled into a smile that was just a shade too amused. "Fascinating. I imagine that must be fulfilling work." "It is," Josephine replied simply. "Creating something with your own hands gives a different kind of satisfaction." Another guest, a woman with an expression of polite disdain, chimed in. "And what sort of work do you do exactly? Furniture, I assume?" Josephine met her gaze steadily. "Among other things. Sculptures, masks, carvings with historical significance." Richard Vander Holt, who had been listening silently, took this as his cue to intervene before the conversation went any further. "Josephine is quite proud of her craft," he said smoothly. "It's a family tradition, I believe." Josephine turned her gaze toward him, recognizing the subtle attempt to place her within the confines of their understanding. "That's correct," she said, "something passed down through generations." The guests exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued but still tinged with thinly veiled superiority. "Ah," one of them mused, "tradition. That's what really matters in the end, isn't it?" There was a chuckle from another side of the table. "Speaking of which," the first guest added, his voice light but edged with something pointed, "what sort of gift does a craftswoman bring to a wedding like this?" The question hung in the air. Naomi tensed. William frowned. It was not an innocent inquiry. It was a challenge, a test, a means of reinforcing the unspoken divide between their world and Josephine's. Josephine, however, remained as composed as ever. She took a sip of water before answering. "Something meaningful," she said. The guest laughed lightly, not quite expecting the simplicity of the response. "Well," he said, gesturing around the lavishly decorated room, "I suppose we could all use a reminder that meaning matters more than price." Richard Vander Holt gave a small, forced smile, eager to redirect the conversation before it continued down this path. "I'm sure Josephine has something very special planned," he said. "Perhaps a handcrafted piece, something simple yet sentimental." Josephine met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. "Perhaps," she said. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered. The Vander Holts did not know it yet, but before the night was over, they would come to understand that Josephine's gift was far more than they had imagined. As the evening continued, the grand wedding reception unfolded with the same orchestrated perfection that the Vander Holts had so meticulously designed. Waiters moved in synchronized motions, refilling glasses with vintage wines, serving delicately plated courses, and ensuring that no guest ever had an empty plate or an unattended need. The orchestra played soft, elegant melodies, providing a backdrop of refined luxury to the sea of impeccably dressed guests. The air was thick with conversation, laughter, and the subtle competition of social standing. Who was wearing what? Who had been invited? Who had secured the most lucrative business deals in recent months? Naomi sat beside William, her hand resting lightly in his as they smiled through yet another round of well wishes and pleasantries. Though she had tried to enjoy the evening, there was an unease in her chest that refused to fade. She could still feel the glances, the hushed comments about her mother, the careful maneuvering of the Vander Holts to ensure Josephine remained a background figure rather than a celebrated part of the event. She knew it had been deliberate, the polite but firm distance placed between her mother and the other high-status guests, the careful sidestepping whenever her presence was acknowledged. It infuriated her, but she had held her tongue, unwilling to let it taint what was meant to be the happiest day of her life. Josephine, however, remained unbothered. She had not come here to impress anyone, nor had she expected anything different. She had seen enough of the world to recognize the quiet, refined cruelty of people like the Vander Holts and their friends. She had spent a lifetime around men who thought money was the only measure of a person's worth. Their whispers did not affect her. Their laughter did not shake her. She sat quietly, watching the evening unfold, waiting for the moment when her gift would be revealed. The time finally arrived when Eleanor Vander Holt gracefully stood from her seat and clinked her glass with a silver spoon. The conversations around the room fell into a hushed anticipation as all eyes turned to her. She smiled, the perfect hostess, radiating a poised elegance as she addressed the room. "My dear friends, family, and esteemed guests," she began, her voice carrying with practiced ease. "It is truly a joyous occasion to celebrate the union of our beloved son, William, and his beautiful wife, Naomi. Tonight, we honor not only their love, but also the coming together of two families, two histories, and the bright future that lies ahead." A round of polite applause followed. Naomi resisted the urge to roll her eyes at the carefully curated words, knowing full well that the Vander Holts saw only one history as truly worth celebrating. Eleanor continued, "As is tradition, we would like to take a moment to recognize the gifts given to the newlyweds, symbols of love, commitment, and the well wishes of those closest to them." Servants began to bring forward beautifully wrapped boxes, each bearing the insignia of the luxury brands they hailed from. There were extravagant pieces of jewelry, rare art pieces, a set of handcrafted Italian crystal glasses, even a deed to a vacation property, gifts fit for the standards of the Vander Holts' elite circle. Then, almost as if it had been forgotten, one of the servants hesitated before bringing forward a different package. It was not wrapped in gleaming paper, nor adorned with ribbons. It was a simple, unassuming bundle, carefully wrapped in dark cloth. There were no visible signs of wealth, no indications of grandeur. Eleanor's smile remained intact, though a barely perceptible flicker of hesitation crossed her eyes as she gestured toward it. "And, of course, we have a special gift from the mother of the bride," she said, her voice carrying a careful neutrality. The servant placed the package before Naomi and William. A ripple of intrigue passed through the crowd, a few murmurs exchanged in hushed voices. Some guests glanced at each other, barely maintaining their curiosity. Naomi reached forward, her fingers gently undoing the cloth wrapping. As the fabric unfolded, the object within was revealed. A beautifully carved wooden mask, rich in detail, polished to a flawless sheen. The deep brown wood held intricate patterns, swirls and ridges that seemed almost alive in their craftsmanship. The eyes of the mask, hollow but expressive, gave it an almost otherworldly presence, as if it held centuries of wisdom within its carved features. A breath of silence passed through the room, then a quiet chuckle. It came from one of the wealthier guests, a man seated near Richard Vander Holt. He leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering something with an amused smirk. Another guest raised a perfectly arched brow, hiding a laugh behind a delicate sip of champagne. A mask, a carved wooden mask. At a wedding of opulence and grandeur, among gifts of wealth and luxury, it was so absurdly out of place that some found it amusing, others pitiful. Eleanor's smile remained fixed, though a shadow of polite discomfort flickered beneath it. Richard cleared his throat. "How unique," he said slowly, his tone carefully measured. "I assume this has some cultural significance." Josephine, who had remained silent until now, nodded once. "It does." Another guest, emboldened by the hushed amusement in the room, tilted his head. "Would you care to share?" Josephine rose slowly from her seat, moving with the deliberate grace of a woman who did not rush for anyone. The room quieted as she took her time walking toward Naomi and William, her gaze unwavering as she rested a hand on the mask. "This mask," she said, her voice even but powerful, "has been in my family for generations. It was carved by my great-great-grandfather, a master craftsman from a time when skill, patience, and meaning were the true measures of a man's worth." The air in the room shifted, the previous amusement faltering under the weight of her words. "This mask," she continued, tracing her fingers over the surface, "was given to my father on his wedding day, just as his father before him. It is a symbol of legacy, of history, of the wisdom passed down from parent to child. It is not gold, it is not encrusted with jewels, but it carries the hands of those who came before us." A hush settled over the guests. Some looked uncertain, others visibly uncomfortable. Eleanor's smile had faded, replaced by a delicate unreadability. Richard said nothing, but his fingers twitched slightly against his wineglass. Josephine turned toward Naomi and William, looking at them, not at the audience, not at the Vander Holts, but at her daughter and the man she had chosen to spend her life with. "I give this to you," she said softly, "not because of its worth in money, but because of its worth in meaning. Because love, family, and legacy are not things that can be bought. They are things that must be honored." A beat of silence. Then William stood. He stepped forward, lifting the mask from the table with reverence. He turned it over in his hands, studying the intricate details, the masterful craftsmanship, the weight of history it carried. "This," he said, his voice firm and unwavering, "is the most valuable gift we've received tonight." The hush deepened. The quiet embarrassment on some guests' faces became shame. Naomi reached forward, taking her mother's hand in hers, her eyes filled with emotion. And, for the first time that evening, Josephine smiled. The air in the grand ballroom had changed. The atmosphere, once filled with quiet arrogance and unshakable confidence in wealth, now felt heavy with something else. An unspoken awareness had settled over the room, creeping into the polished conversations, into the measured glances exchanged between guests, into the very walls of the gilded space. The lavish decor, the shimmering chandeliers, the crystal glasses and golden plates that had once seemed like the centerpiece of the evening now faded into the background. All that remained in sharp relief was the image of Josephine standing calmly, her hands resting at her sides, the weight of her history and legacy filling the space more completely than all the riches in the room combined. For the first time in their lives, Richard and Eleanor Vanderholt were at a loss for words. Their carefully curated celebration, designed to showcase their status and superiority, had been overshadowed by something they had never anticipated. A simple, irreplaceable gift that could not be measured in monetary value had become the defining moment of the night. Their guests, some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in their circles, had fallen silent. It was clear that they too had felt the shift, though few would ever admit it aloud. Richard clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the stem of his wineglass. He had always believed in power, the kind of power that came from wealth, from lineage, from influence, and yet he had just witnessed something he could not control, could not belittle, could not buy. His world, built on exclusivity and privilege, had just been quietly undermined by a woman he had dismissed before the evening had even begun. Eleanor, ever the master of composure, took a slow sip of her wine, schooling her expression into one of polite neutrality. She had spent decades ensuring that the Vanderholt name carried weight, that their family remained untouchable in its prestige. And yet, here stood a woman with calloused hands and a simple suit, a woman they had subtly scorned, who had just commanded the attention of a room filled with aristocrats without raising her voice or flashing a single piece of gold. Naomi stood beside her mother, her head held high, the warmth of quiet pride radiating from her. William was next to her, still holding the mask in his hands as though it were the most delicate and precious thing he had ever touched. The silence stretched until at last Richard cleared his throat. "A remarkable history," he said finally, his voice measured, though not quite as steady as before. "Truly, your family has carried this tradition for generations. That is commendable." There was no conviction behind his words, no arrogance, but no sincerity either. It was the response of a man who had spent his life in control, now grasping for something solid to hold on to. Josephine met his gaze evenly. "It is more than commendable," she said. "It is unbreakable." Eleanor let out a quiet breath, setting her wineglass down. "Naomi," she said smoothly, turning to her daughter-in-law, "we appreciate the significance of such a gift, and of course it is clear that your mother values tradition deeply." Naomi saw the attempt at regaining control for what it was. "Yes," she said, "she does, because some traditions hold more value than wealth ever could." There was a shift among the guests. A few nodded slightly, others looked away, their discomfort evident. Some, those who understood the weight of legacy beyond material possessions, looked at Josephine with newfound respect. Others, like the Vanderholts, struggled to reconcile their worldview with the reality they had just witnessed. William took a step forward, placing the mask carefully on the table in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear. "I've spent my life surrounded by things that are supposed to represent power, status, wealth. Everything I was taught to strive for was about making sure our family name remained untouchable." He turned his gaze to his parents. "But I realized something tonight." Eleanor tensed. Richard's jaw twitched. The guests leaned in slightly. William looked at Naomi, then at Josephine. "Wealth fades. Status is temporary. Power is an illusion." He rested a hand on the mask. "But this means something real." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, his pride clearly bristling at the turn the evening had taken. "William, you speak as though legacy is not built on stability, on ensuring a future for the generations to come." Josephine's gaze remained steady. "And yet, the wealthiest empires fall," she said. "The strongest legacies are the ones carried in the hearts of people, not in the numbers on a bank ledger." Richard stiffened. Eleanor's lips pressed together in a thin line. The room remained tense, the weight of Josephine's words pressing down like an undeniable truth. One of the guests, an older man with sharp eyes and a thoughtful expression, suddenly let out a quiet chuckle. "You know," he said, tapping a finger against the rim of his wine glass, "I've spent a lifetime buying things I thought would make me feel important. And yet, I don't own a single thing with the kind of history that Mask carries." Another guest nodded. "True wealth, indeed." Richard and Eleanor remained silent, their carefully constructed world fracturing in the face of something they could not refute. Josephine simply inclined her head. "We all choose what we leave behind. The question is whether it will be remembered." The evening carried on, but the mood had shifted irreversibly. The conversations that followed lacked the usual shallow bravado of high society. Some guests approached Josephine, asking about the craftsmanship of the mask, the stories of her ancestors, listening in a way they had not before. Others, including Richard and Eleanor, remained withdrawn, processing what had unfolded. Naomi and William stood side by side, watching as the world they had once known struggled to accommodate something greater than itself. As the night came to an end, Josephine prepared to leave. Naomi embraced her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Josephine smiled, resting a weathered hand against her daughter's cheek. "This is your journey now," she said. "Make it one worth remembering." William extended his hand, and for the first time, Josephine clasped it, not just as her daughter's husband, but as a man who had finally seen the truth beyond the surface. As she walked away, her figure retreating into the quiet of the evening, there was no doubt left in the minds of anyone who had witnessed the night's events. The richest woman in the room had never been Eleanor Vander Holt. It had been Josephine all along. And just like that, the truth shattered their illusions. In a room filled with wealth and status, the richest person had never been the one they expected. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything.